Love has taken hold and it won't let go of us now.
Something here is calling us forward, upward motion. We're drops in one ocean. Roll on.
Will you rise up with me today? Lift up your voice
and boldly say,
we are the ones we've been waiting for. Live the dream of your highest calling. Be the hope of a new day dawning. We're the ones who can make a difference. Let's stand together. Sharing gifts for the world that's waiting for a change that we're all creating. It's a
Good evening and welcome everyone to New Thought on the News, one of 4 in a series of online webinars produced by the Association for Global New Thought to support us as a community in our mission of spiritually guided social activism. I'm Barbara Fields, Executive Director of AGNT. We came up with the idea of New Thought on the News because it's time for a fresh, much more conscious approach to the news of our time. This series is a chance for us to have real dialogue on hot topics in the news as seen through the evolutionary lens of New Thought's spiritual principles. Over time, we hope you'll weigh in and tell us what newsworthy issues most affect you and your community, and maybe we can offer some radically new interpretations of the stories we're being told by the mainstream media. Together, we'll discuss conscious approaches that can help us understand and respond with realism, strength, and vision to the challenges we face. So starting off tonight, I'd like to introduce you to my co-host this evening, Reverend Temple Hayes. She's a valued member of the AGNT Leadership Council. She is CEO of the First Unity Spiritual Campus, a New Thought Center in St. Petersburg, Florida. She's a successful radio host on Unity FM with her show, The Intentional Spirit, Seeing and Being. She is author of The Right to Be You and How to Speak Unity. Her latest book, When Did You Die? 8 Steps to Stop Dying Every Day and Start Waking Up, is an Amazon bestseller, great title. Temple is also founder of Global Peace Workers, a 501c3, which focuses on Peace Through People initiative. She's on the Advisory Council for Global Action Coalition, dedicated to bringing change to our world. She also founded Life Rights, a nonprofit dedicated to education, teaching, and supporting the awareness of valuing life in all living things, creating a world living for peace. And she was recognized for Life Rights on Capitol Hill at the People of Distinction Humanitarian Awards in September of 2016. So to begin, I'd like to invite Temple to say hello and lead us in an opening invocation. Temple?
Hello, everyone, and let's join together and bring our consciousness together for this incredible evening that we're going to have with Dr. Barbara Fields and with Jim Kenney. So we are now in the presence of pure being, and in this space, whatever thoughts we may have had or whatever thoughts we will have, there is this emerging conversation and connection that is possible in this space. We align with the identification of connecting on a deeper level, that we are asking the right questions, therefore we are living through the right answers. And so we allow this time to unfold, being totally present and engaged in our spirituality, and we let it be so, and so it is. And so at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Kenney. He is co-founder and executive director at Common Ground, an adult educational organization and study center headquartered in Chicago. He is also author of Thriving in the Crosscurrent, Clarity and Hope in a Time of Cultural Sea Change, founding trustee, International Committee for the Peace Council, and project coordinator, bringing together influential religious and spiritual leaders to serve world peace. Co-editor, Interreligious Insight Journal, former founding trustee and global director, Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions. Welcome, Jim Kenney. Thank you for being with us, and how timely that we are together right now.
Thanks very much. We really, I think, had a good time last session, and glad to be here again.
So I wanted to back us up and review that this series is based on Jim's book and his model of cultural sea change. We've been offering to you free on our website a 4-part tutorial that is where we've posted recordings for every section, and if you have not already seen it, it's really worth going to, because it'll help you understand a context for how we're framing issues in New Thought on the News. You just go to agnt.today/recordings and really owe it to yourself to get in depth at these discussions where Jim really introduces the overarching concepts that frame the conversation, and it will really be worth your while. We've had a lot of great feedback around that. There's also some valuable handouts there that'll guide you through our conversations on these live salons. So let's move forward. I would like to say that it was a more cheerful topic, but tonight we're unavoidably going to take a look at what has recently happened in Florida, which seems to be an epidemic that's happening on too regular a basis now. We're going to be looking at what are we supposed to do about guns and gun control, mental illness. How do we keep our children safe in the face of all this? We're starting to get a little bit too used to this, and I don't know how many of you know Dr. Lawrence Carter from the Martin Luther King Chapel at Morehouse College, but the phrase that he used with us recently is, he's calling this a parade of horrors. So tonight, with Jim and with Temple, we're going to take a no-nonsense look at policies such as gun control. We're not trying to alienate people by setting up a polarizing conversation where we're right and you're wrong. I hope we're past that kind of thinking at this point. But we do know that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And we have to back up how we believe in justice and human rights and these issues and move forward instead of continuing to circle in the conversation. So I think tonight we'll be taking a look, not so much as Second Amendment rights, as Second Amendment responsibilities, and framing it that way. Those who come from seemingly opposite positions might better be asked to define the goal they're working toward these days. So it might be something like, we're all working toward empowering the will of we the people. And maybe we'd find that we agree more than we disagree if we would just take a step back, if we could realize that we've been allowing ourselves to be emotionally manipulated by hot-button issues that keep the culture wars battle alive, so that conveniently we cannot come together to enforce a higher stand for our own governance. So what I'd like to do right now is I want to show you a short video that Michael Beckwith recorded on the issue of Florida and the recent gun incident there. It's just a short video, but I think it'll be instructive and helpful as we move forward in this discussion. So just give me a second here.
Peace and blessings. Peace and blessings to you today. During this moment of reflection from the Association for Global New Thought Leadership, I am Michael Bernard Beckwith, the founder of Agape International and the president and co-founder of the Association for Global New Thought. And we do have a lot to reflect upon. We're reflecting upon who we are as a nation. We're reflecting upon who we are as people, who we are as a society, who we are as a civilization. We want to bring the civil back to our civilization if possible. So the first thing that I want to reflect upon are the individuals who will go home and their children will not be in their beds. The parents, the grandparents, the uncles, the aunts, the sisters, the brothers of these individuals who've been murdered by an individual who purchased a gun legally and premeditatedly murdered, created a sense of mayhem throughout that particular state and the entire nation. So the first thing we want to do is we want to embrace these people who will never, ever see their family members again. We want to have a level of compassion and kindness in our heart to emerge as we think about those individuals, as we think about the individuals who lost their loved ones in Las Vegas, as we think about the individuals who have lost their lives almost every year to this wanton violence, individuals shooting other individuals. And we want to begin to reflect upon who we want to be as a nation. We want to begin to reimagine and re-enchant our imaginations, so we begin to see the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of culture we want to emerge from our nation. And that culture right now is fraught with violence, it's fraught with hate and separation and even racism and bigotry. We want to re-enchant the imagination so we can begin to think about our country with tremendous good citizenship, good people. I remember when I was going to school as a young boy, we had citizenship grades in school. We were given qualities such as kindness and compassion and love and patience to grow into, and we got a grade in that. We had to reflect upon the kind of people where we are becoming. We need to do that again in our nation. And we finally need to do what Australia did. Australia in 1996, after a tremendous massacre that killed a number of people, they had the courage, the inner chutzpah, the confidence, and the maturity to finally pass a gun law that reflected the kind of country they wanted to live in. The country bought back all the prohibited weapons. First of all, they made certain weapons prohibited. They bought those guns back from the citizens. And they bought other guns back. And individuals began to voluntarily turn in their guns. And since 1996 to this present moment, the homicide rate has gone down every single year. And there has been no mass murders. There's been no mayhem of individuals shooting people wantonly. We want to rise up and have that kind of courage. We want to let go of the fantastical fantasies that somebody is trying to get you and your family. No one is trying to get you and your family. They're trying to get your television set, maybe. They're trying to get your radio, no one is out to get you and your family. So we want to let go of the narrative that I need a gun because somebody's coming to get me and my family. That's a ridiculous, immature narrative. It is time to mature, people. It is time to grow up spiritually. It is time to let go of the cowardice narrative. It is time to reframe the Second Amendment and allow it to blossom into something that's way more beautiful than the immature cowardice perception that fuels a narrative. Fuels a narrative that the weapons industry uses to keep people hyped up in fear and doubt and worry. I want you to reflect upon the fact that a nation is a new nation, a new culture is trying to emerge. Not a culture of violence and separation, but a culture of love and compassion, generosity, creativity, resourcefulness, innovativeness, and a culture of courage. Let's reflect upon that real courage. Let's begin to embrace a real conversation about prohibiting certain weapons that anyone can go by legally. And let us be aware that in some cases it is a mental illness issue, but that's not the real narrative. The real narrative is the weapons industry creates fantastic tales that individuals bite into, swallow whole without digesting, and live a life of fear. I believe where you are concerned, there's courage there, real courage, not cowardice, but courage. And it's time to embrace these individuals who have lost loved ones in prayer. And it's time to rise in courage and confidence to make a meaningful gun law that will begin to downsize the homicide rate and up-level the love and compassion rate. Let us hang in prayer together and have meaningful dialogue. Peace and richest blessings to you.
So Temple, I think that I'd like to start here by asking you, could you bring us back into the discussion by thinking about the question, what constitutes a New Thought perspective on these current events?
Well, I think that is the profoundness of the New Thought teachings, is that we're able to live with great confidence and esteem in a both and reality so that we can create permanent solutions in what we're called to solve right here and right now. First of all, we'll be posting on our AG&T Facebook page the Australian ideas for all of you to review and look at, because as Michael said, they are profound in what they did. And I love what he said. They envisioned what they wanted to see. You know, they had the shock and the reality, but they envisioned and called in, what is it that we want to see our country be, and what can we become? And as so many of us that are dedicated to our teaching know, that is the truth in that reality. One of the things we're very clear on with the Association of Global New Thought is that we do not allow the breaking news to break us. And that is a key part. The more that these situations have occurred since the profoundness of Sandy Hook, many of us, like Jim, myself, many other leaders out in the field that teach these spiritual values, we don't get down, we get more expansive. In other words, we get more committed than ever to teach what we continue to teach about people having a respect for life and valuing life and all living things. We continue that message every day. But more so than that, we look at ways to use engaged spirituality that there can be a solution. One of the things that I noted, and I urge all of you as leaders and speakers and teachers with your ideas to send them to the local newspaper. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've become, quite brave and bold, and I'm sending things to the paper all the time because I know that for me, I don't want this to be yet another time, Jim and Barbara, that we see the killing and then we find out about the murderer and what he did and who he was. And then we see all the images of all the children and the teachers, and we mourn and we feel sad and everything. And then before you know it, a few months go by and here we are again. I want to see this as with Parkland, Florida, that we park in the land of our forefathers and we make this our most significant time that matters, that we're not here a few months down the road talking about the same thing. One of the challenges is if we look at the comments and stuff like that, we live in a place that people need to learn that you can look at both sides and there's a solution somewhere in the middle. And being comfortable with that and the New Thought perspective is that people say, well, it's not really guns, it's mental illness. Well, it's not really mental, it's this, that, and the other. And what happens, or at least in my own humble opinion, is just becomes a distraction. And we get so into the debate of what it is really that at the end of the day, we must still realize that the vehicle called a gun is what ultimately takes the life of another human being. I was just reflecting on the idea that when I was an addict, an active addict, and I was driving a vehicle when I didn't need to be under the influence, and that vehicle was taken from me by law because I no longer was able to practice the right of responsibility, and I wasn't able to drive that vehicle because I might hurt someone else or take a life. And that was in place. And even now, I've been sober 30 years. I can move to South Carolina and be 90 years old. It's still going to be on the computer. I still have to take a driving class about what alcohol does to you, and I have to pay special insurance. And I didn't even ever hurt anyone. I could have. And that's the part of the ability to see clearly that we must do something about the vehicle called a weapon that is killing and murdering. So the biggest new thought perspective is that we value life and we really believe that we're not designed to kill our own. And that would be that part. And now to you, Jim.
Well, we've decided each at the beginning of each one of these to talk about a particular idea that is instrumental in shaping the perspective in my book. Just to reprise a little bit, the book is about the idea that there is such a thing as cultural evolution, that cultures do evolve, that they don't merely change, that cultures evolve when their dominant values move toward a closer fit with reality. So gradually it takes time, but we get over the idea that slavery is legitimate. We get over the idea that men are superior to women in every way. We get over the idea that the earth is unfragile and that there's nothing we can do, or that the earth, is unfragile and that there's nothing we can do to harm it. We get over the idea, for example, that social and economic justice and universal human rights are foolish goals, way out of reach of any society. And we begin to realize that none of that is true, that all of those things can be dealt with, all of those things can be realized, that we can live in search of and actively engage with ideas of peace and nonviolent conflict resolution. As I said before, social and economic justice and universal human rights and ecological sustainability. Those three, by the way, are often abbreviated PJS, peace, justice, and sustainability. But when you pitch that idea, when you say, there's such a thing as cultural evolution, and it goes on all the time. I also should mention that I add that cultural evolution is punctuated. There are these rare periods, I call them sea changes, where our progress toward a closer fit with reality, the progress of our values toward a closer fit with reality is dramatically accelerated. I believe that there have been maybe 3 of those periods in human prehistory and history, and that we're right smack dab in the middle of one now. But people ask, okay, how can you possibly believe that? And look around and consider who is the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. How can you take all that into consideration and think about shootings at like the shooting at Parkland and so on? How can you look around and say that anything is getting better? And I'm arguing that values do. Well, one of the complications is that if you offer up the idea that cultures evolve, they don't merely change, you're going to have at least two different groups of respondents. And we wanted to say a word or two about that tonight. One group I refer to as the Yaysayers, and the Yaysayers are activists and they're spiritual seekers and they're cutting edge thinkers, they're creative thinkers, cultural creatives, and they're agents of change. But on the other side, you have the naysayers. And the naysayers are those who insist that cultures do not evolve. They don't get better. If anything, they devolve. And these are, it seems to me, people who are, first of all, culturally confused or apathetic. They don't pay enough attention to what's going on to have a strong view one way or the other. But so that's one group. Another group, and I think this is the most dangerous of the groups. These are people who are so threatened by the change that they find their very identities challenged. These are the people who are going through an identity crisis. And I think some of the most dangerous people in the world are people, dangerous to themselves, by the way, as well as others, are people who feel their basic identity threatened. So if I was raised to believe, as many people in our country have been, that the key to my success is to be white, male, and Christian, and suddenly I find that's just not as true as it was. Now I'm expected, as a white person, I'm expected to give respect and even affection to people of color. As a male, I'm supposed to change my whole attitude toward women. I'm supposed to give my assent to programs of gender equity. And I'm supposed to respect and perhaps even admire other religions and people of other religions. I always think about the poor guy that wakes up in the morning and he says or he thinks to himself that being white, male, and Christian is the secret of success. And he goes to work and he finds himself reporting to a black Muslim female as his superior. That's got to shake up your day. And it's that kind of identity crisis. If you look at who goes in and shoots up a school, someone whose identity has been ripped away from him in one way or another. So I think to understand the difference between yaysayers and naysayers is critical. Another part of the answer when you say, well, why is it that if we're in this period of cultural evolutionary value change, and I believe the evidence is overwhelming, it's on all sides of us, things are changing, they're changing dramatically. But if you believe that, why is it that it doesn't feel like that all the time? And one reason is that patterns of resistance, I call them eddies. I think of them as countercultural whirlpools of resistance to the flowing stream of cultural evolutionary shift. Eddies are generated, and I think that the naysayers are the people who are caught up in those eddies, and no one is more vulnerable to being whirled away or sent whirling by one of these whirlpools of resistance than the person whose identity is threatened. So I just want to say a couple of things about the problem we're facing tonight. And one is we have all this talk about the Second Amendment. Marco Rubio said something the other day about people who want to undo the Second Amendment. Justice Clarence Thomas chose on Friday to offer a ringing dissent against the court's opinion not to hear a challenge to a California modification of its already strict gun control policy. And a group of interested parties, Second Amendmenters, had sued or had brought the case to the Supreme Court. And the court refused to hear it, and Clarence Thomas protested. And he said, you know, if this had been a case of abortion or freedom of the press or freedom of religion, it would have been heard. But those are favored rights, and apparently the Second Amendment right is not favored by this court. I thought it would be worth reading what the Second Amendment actually says. It's very short, and it says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But it starts with a well-regulated militia. It does not start with a well-stocked gun cabinet in the home of an individual. Why do we need a well-regulated militia? Well, James Madison, who's responsible for that ending up in what came to be called the Bill of Rights, knew that southern states would not ratify the Constitution if they didn't have some sort of guarantee that the federal government would not take away their right to form state militias. Why do they want state militias? One reason and one reason only: to capture and bring back runaway slaves. That was the whole point of a state militia. So that's where the Second Amendment is born. But if there are eddies of resistance, we have to ask ourselves, how do eddies dissipate? And I have a lot of answers to that question. I think they dissipate eventually simply because they are resisting a flow of ideas whose time has simply come. But one of the reasons that I have great confidence that most of the eddies of our time, the resistance to the decline of patriarchy, the resistance to social and economic justice, the resistance to ecological sustainability. One reason why I'm confident that these will all dissipate in time is the next generation. And boy, we're seeing it now. And I think something has tipped. I think this is different from all of the periods of outrage that have followed previous mass shootings. And if you think about it, I think a lot of people fail to understand the nature of movements. And I just want to end by asking us all to remember the movements we have lived through. The civil rights movement. All of us lived through it. And it was, if you go back to 1954, when the Supreme Court handed down the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling, which was the first in a series of critical, pivotal rulings, in 1954, it seemed impossible that we would ever achieve what was achieved in 64 and 65 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It seemed impossible that we would ever break up the incredible racial logjam. I'm not one, by the way, who believes that we have put our racism and racialism behind us. We haven't. But anybody that doesn't understand how far we have come is a head in the sand. And then think about the women's movement. Who would have imagined? If we could go back to a day in 1964, I like to imagine a group of women. For some reason, I put them on the Ann Arbor campus because it's a very campusy looking campus, and it's a rainy day, and they've just come back to the apartment of one of them, and they've been out trying to raise consciousness. It's an early day in the women's movement, and these 5 or 6 young women are burned out, and they're angry, and they're fed up, and they're this close to quitting, and they don't quit. The men in their lives clearly don't get it, but sadly, many of the women in their lives don't get it, and they don't quit. And think about how far we have come. Now, I know we have a huge distance yet to travel, but gender equity is now so clearly within reach that something has happened. Look at how quickly the gay rights movement accomplished what it accomplished. And you've got political leaders that fought it tooth and nail, that suddenly woke up and discovered that they had always been in favor of gay rights, even though they'd fought it all their lives. The Me Too movement. Imagine that could have happened as rapidly as it has happened. And what about this latest Never Again, the movement for some kind of gun control and sanity? I think this has all the earmarks of a movement that's going to go over the top. And to hear the president say, now's the time to arm the teachers. Holy cow. I mean, I don't even want to comment on it because it's such a moronic statement. If that's polarizing, I'm sorry, but it's crazy. So I think the good news is that movements move, and that no eddy ever reversed the prevailing flow of the stream. It's not going to happen this time either.
Thanks, Jim. Wow, that brings up so many things that we could comment on before we go on, and I'm wondering if, Stephen, can you hear us? Stephen Pope, who's been in on some of these sessions, we were talking a little bit about the fact that people don't really understand the underlying motivation of why Congress reacts as it does to the NRA and its propositions. And I wanted to ask Stephen if he would share a little bit from his perspective about the motivation that the government doesn't always want us to know so much about, which is probably the unseen villain in all of these discussions about gun control. So, Stephen, I'm going to ask you to talk about that from your perspective a little bit.
Gladly. First, I just wanted to thank both Temple and James for sharing their thoughts. What came to me, looking at the whole discussion of the last 4 or 5 days, is this focus on the NRA and treating it as though we're some membership-driven grassroots organization, which it's not. The NRA has about 4 million members, meaning 2% of the adult population. They are certainly not all single-issue voters, as it's frequently depicted. My father is an NRA member because he's a hunter, and he's certainly not a single-issue Second Amendment voter, and he lives in Vermont, one of the most liberal states. And if you look now, there, people are publicizing these lists of how many tens of millions of dollars every election cycle the NRA has to invest. And it should be obvious, this is weapons industry lobbying money that is being laundered to look like it comes from a grassroots membership organization. So I think in terms of framing, if we're going to try to take back the language we discuss these issues, we have to correct people when they say the NRA. And we have to say, no, these senators are bought and paid for by the weapons industry lobby. And it's not, Wayne LaPierre doesn't work for the millions of members of the NRA. He works for the weapons industry. So I think that's what Barbara was referring to, just to take back the discussion, because I've worked in other fields, for example, with prison unions, where the union is doing something that is antithetical and not not supported by the majority of the members, but the union is so well funded by an industry that it does the industry's bidding. And I think the NRA is absolutely that case. And there have been polls that most NRA members want background checks and waiting periods and many of these policies. So I think it behooves us to talk about the weapons industry, not the NRA.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that all this information is very clarifying, and I wondered if, Temple, if you were having some thoughts as Jim and Stephen were speaking, if you wanted to share any of those now.
I just couldn't agree with Jim more in that I do find that every now and then it's so valuable for people to stop and assess exactly how far we have come. And especially, when people begin to get weary, and many people went into weariness as of November of last year. But what's been profound is to see all the people speaking out since November of last year. We've had more marches and more movements and more people coming forward than I ever recall seeing in my lifetime. Right, Jim? I mean, it's just really brought everything up to a critical mass of change, or as you say, an evolution whose time has come.
Yeah, Jim, did you want to just continue a little more deeply into this discussion before? And I also want to make people who are attending perfectly aware that we want to hear your comments and questions in a little bit as well. So please be thinking about how you'd like to dive into the discussion yourself. So I'm going to ask Jim to deepen our thoughts just a little bit.
Well, somehow I found myself thinking when Stephen was talking about the NRA, first of all, I totally agree with that. I think that that's a very thoughtful and important perspective. He's absolutely right. Where's the money really coming from? It's not membership dues that make it possible for the NRA, for example, to invest $30 million in Donald Trump's election campaign. $30 million. It was interesting today to hear the president. I saw a show that was intercutting Wayne LaPierre with the president. And here's Wayne LaPierre speaking yesterday, and here's the president speaking today, and they are practically word for word. But what I was thinking about is the term pro-life. Now, it's often been suggested that the far right in this country is better at languaging than is the left, the progressive left. And so they end up talking about we're the ones that are pro-life, and the left is, well, let's just say the left, for want of a better term, is stuck with pro-choice. It's just not as strong. But I worked fairly closely with the late Cardinal Joseph Bernardin When Barbara, when you and I were working together on the first modern parliament of the world's religions that was held in 1993, and Cardinal Bernardine, who's one of the most extraordinary people I've ever known in my life, uh, I remember when we were going around the world trying to get people involved in that first Parliament of Religions that brought 8,000 people to Chicago to talk about what religions together could do to make a better, healthier world. People would say, well, who's involved? And we would say, well, Joe Bernardine and the Dalai Lama. And always the response was, well, then, count me in. But Bernardine used to talk about pro-life, and he said, we can't call ourselves pro-life unless we are pro-life right across the board. Yes, we oppose abortion, but we're also opposed to the death penalty. We're also opposed in principle to war. We also are opposed to the proliferation of weapons. And he used to say this, that some people that call themselves pro-life are only concerned about the life until the moment of birth. And once the child is born, they no longer care whether that child starves, gets a good education, lives in a safe community, and so on. So if you're going to be pro-life, you need to be pro-life right down the line. And so I would really like to see those who are concerned about sane gun control, some kind of restriction on weapons that our founding fathers could not have imagined. Anyone who thinks that the founders could even have envisioned automatic weapons or thought that on every mantelpiece there needed to be a weapon of war doesn't understand the period or those people. I would like to see the activists and these young people, I'd like to hear them call themselves pro-life and challenge us to think about what that means. So I'll throw that out first.
Yeah, I'd like to bite on that one. What did we heard something the other night about the fact that these 15 and 16-year-old kids are speaking so articulately on this issue, and that they're going to be voting in a few years. And I heard the comment, someone said, well, we have to back up and think about how really bad things can be catalysts for really good things. For example, the George Bush administration gave us Obama. So whatever the Donald Trump administration and all that goes along with it are going to give us, it might be something very encouraging, because the lower you go, it's like a slingshot. The more force you pull back with on that string, the further the trajectory of the intention going forward. And someone that was half kidding said, these kids are getting so fed up because they're seeing their friends killed on a regular basis. They're learning, they're articulating, they're keeping up with the news, they're getting involved in social action in their communities. And, what if we lowered the voting age to 16? We couldn't possibly do any worse. And then another person on that particular program I was watching said, or maybe we could get them into Congress. That might not be worse either. So I guess my feeling here is that we could put a lot of energy into supporting the young people that are showing promise for bringing a movement that's going to have to sustain itself at a very high level of efficacy as we move forward. We have to make sure that these younger people can have everything they need from us to be able to receive the education, be empowered, et cetera, et cetera. I see that Jim is raising his finger, so I'm going to throw it to him.
I'm just thinking about young Emma Gonzalez that we all heard after Parkland, the young lady with the very, very short hair. Do you know that her words were heard all over the world? I mean, that's stunning. And this movement is not just a Florida movement. Students across the country are planning things like sit-ins and walkouts and days of silence and so on to make their point. I also read the other day that there are now 150,000 kids in America that have lived through one of these days. 150,000. And in a sense, as tragic and heartbreaking as that is, they're perhaps our great hope.
I'm seeing that Stephen is raising his hand, and by all means, Temple or anyone else jump into the discussion. Stephen?
I just wanted to piggyback and expand a little bit on something Jim said before, because of course part of this discussion revolves around the Second Amendment to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, as Jim described. And again, it says a well-regulated militia being necessary. I like to think of that logically, because of course we have a well-regulated militia. It's called a standing army or the National Guard. And if I have a statement where I say, because A, therefore B, and A is not the case, then B is not the case. That's just what you call predicate logic. So I like to make the extreme case of, at the time of the writing of the Constitution, they might have said, because we don't have indoor plumbing, everybody has the right to have an outhouse within 20 feet of their home. And of course, nowadays, people would say, yeah, we have indoor plumbing, so we should abridge the right to have outhouses. So I think it's important to say, as Jim said, this idea of a well-regulated militia, even independent of the fact that it was all about slavery in the South, which Jim called attention to, that the word militia was the white slave owners' militia. People in the North didn't use that word. But just logically, if the premise is no longer valid, the conclusion doesn't follow. So I think we also really have to push back on the Second Amendment. And I know people are saying we want to take their guns away. We want to, yes, we absolutely, it is time to, I know it's not realistic to have a constitutional convention and amend it, but that would be the right thing to do. And we should say out loud, that is the right thing to do.
Thanks. Temple or anyone else who's attending, would anyone else like to ask a question or make a comment? The way that I can tell, Temple, if you want to jump in, is if you kind of indicate with your hand. Yes? Okay.
Well, I'm a firm believer in the New Thought teachings that we are healed by what we turn towards, not what we turn away from. I think that we'll all agree that's why we were founded in the first place, is that we address conditions that we could see a different answer to. And I love, what Jim was saying, in that these young people today, and what I love and value about their talks and their signs, is they're calling it what it is. And it's so powerful. We're tired of being murdered. We're tired of being killed. I mean, they are just shooting it straight. They're not just making it soft talk. They are right to the point. And it's very powerful. And I feel very strongly that they are, and we are collectively going to see a change this time.
Thank you. Anyone attending that would like to jump in here? I'm actually seeing, we have a lot of pretty vehement chat activity going on here. And I wondered if anybody wanted me to put them on the screen and jump into the discussion, because we can wrap up this with some comments that we're all holding and want to continue to make. But I want to make sure that if you do want to ask a question or join the discussion, that you raise your hand, because that's what this format is meant for. So, okay, well, I'm going to ask Jim again, because in light of your personal philosophy about cultural evolution and sea change, I guess the question that comes to mind, also taking into account what Temple just said, what are we intending for in the future, rather than letting our energy be sapped by everything that we want to move away from in the past, even though we know we need to be educated and aware and pay attention. We can't just bury our head in the sand. That's not the intention. But can you give us some hope from the point of view of cultural sea change about not just what might bring us out of depression or apathy, but what kinds of constructive actions should we be most likely to engage in right now in order to be effective in any way?
Well, it's the thing about movements is that you have to participate. You have to join. People often say, I hear this question all the time. Yeah, but what can I do? And that comes from a place of feeling powerless. And I really understand why people feel powerless. But there are ways to get involved. And what I usually say is, don't get involved in 10 movements. Get involved in one, and get involved in how, whatever way you can. Get involved by making a contribution. Better still, contribute a little bit of time. Also very effective, have a conversation with someone you might ordinarily not be speaking to about something that's critical to you. There are all sorts of little ways, and those have a way of growing into bigger ways. But I wanted to say this: how do movements advance? And how does, for example, sea change? How does cultural evolution advance? And related to that is the question, and how do eddies dissipate? How do these whirlpool storms of crazy resistance, when you see, for example, when you see anti-feminism and anti-woman movements and actions rising up again, seeming to gather energy, you need to understand that not as the wave of the future, but as a backlash against the wave of the future. The wave of the future is gender equity. I think there's no question about that. But some of the forms of resistance to it are ugly indeed, and we're seeing that in our time. But there are two characteristic features of cultural evolutionary advance that also characterize the dissipation or the decline of these whirlpools of crazy resistance. And one of those is an anomaly. And an anomaly is something that happens. This is a word that's often misunderstood. An anomaly is something that happens, but it's something that, according to our prevailing way of thinking, shouldn't have happened, right? So for those who say what we need to do in order to stem the tide of gun violence is to have more guns in society. If everyone were armed, no one would ever fire a weapon. That's the crazy logic of that. If 20%, the president said today, if 20% of our teachers were armed and trained, he actually went ahead to say, and you could give them a little bonus and it would be cheaper than hiring a guard. But if 20% of our teachers were armed, that would stem gun violence. But that begs the question, it ignores the question, what happens? How do you account for the fact that Great Britain had a mass shooting, banned weapons in a very serious way, and has had nothing more? Australia, as Michael said earlier, same thing. One big mass shooting in the late 90s, a strict gun control policy, buying back guns, nothing more. Japan never has had an incident of that sort. Countries in Europe have not experienced that. Why? Because they have strict gun laws. So an anomaly, something that you wouldn't expect to happen given the prevailing ethos, is that if you diminish the number of guns in circulation, you should have a society that is more dangerous. Turns out that's not the case at all. So you've got anomalies, things that happen that shouldn't have happened. We believe that the environment was unfragile, therefore we shouldn't be able to hurt it. Now it's finally dawning on us that we have hurt it severely. That's an anomaly, something that happened that shouldn't have happened. But on the other side of anomalies are ahas. And ahas are the surprising happenings, the movements, the stirrings, the spark that you see in people's eyes and that you hear in their voices. And I think the Me Too movement was an aha experience for the country. I think this Never Again movement is another aha experience for the country. So you've got anomalies, which are the surprises that are hints to us that we're on the wrong course, and the ahas, which remind us that the right course is taking shape right before our eyes. And we're in one of those wonderful, tragically wonderful moments.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I see that we've got a question or a comment, and it's someone that Jim, you might remember from our conference in Italy, Jeanette Baust. Jeanette, I'm going to put you on the screen and turn on your audio so that you can ask your question or make your comment. Hi, can you hear?
I can hear. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Go ahead. Hi, how are you?
I'm here in Philadelphia still, so I just wanted to add to the discussion that I'm always very aware during these moments that it's white schools being shut up, and it tends to be white people who are now up in arms. When a number of my friends of color say, our kids have been shot up for generations, and people were not alarmed about getting rid of the guns. So I value all that I've heard, and it's been very important and some very enlightening. But I want to continue to put that in context, why I think it's hard to bridge the gap right now with some people in different racial groups, because they're saying, wow, why wasn't there this kind of feeling and concern when it was our children? And I just think that's an important piece to add to the mix.
Thanks, Jeanette. I can completely agree with that. And I see there's been a chat box question reminding us, I think it's Kathy, she hasn't raised her hand, but she pointed out that there's a great film that is related very much to your comment, Jeanette, the 13th, it's called 13th, it's about the 13th Amendment, about the devastating effect that our justice protocol for incarcerated African-American male individuals perpetuates, and what we don't know about that formula and why it's so overwhelmingly destructive. So Kathy had said, make sure you mention that you can even find it on YouTube, this film called The 13th, to check that out, because it plays right into what you're talking about. We're getting pretty close to the end of the hour, and I like that this stuff is free flowing, because we have to keep alert somehow and be ready to think and respond and be able to take in information without becoming completely paralyzed and devastated by it. So I'm going to ask both Jim and Temple, first Temple and then Jim, to make just a couple of closing remarks, and then I'll come back and tell you about when our next New Thought on the News program will be. So Temple, would you like to jump in?
Well, I want to say, first of all, Jim, what a pleasure, and Stephen and Barbara, that it has been to be with you tonight. And I want to thank everyone participating, and I just feel better than ever before for the movement, because we do have a AHA movement called the Association of Global New Thought. And so get involved with us and participate with us, because we have ongoing activities and we are on the move. So it's been a pleasure being with you.
I'd just like to thank everyone, and Temple, I reciprocate. It's been really fun to be with you as well. And I'd just like to say hi again to Jeanette. And I do remember you from Italy, and I agree with what you had to say. I'd just like to make sure that we all understand that the overwhelming, I believe at least, the overwhelming majority of people that are concerned about this latest shooting would absolutely endorse what Jeanette said. That we have been silent, we have been late, we have ignored the fact that shootings happen daily, hourly, in some neighborhoods that are inhabited by people of color, and the rest of the population just seems able to ignore it, just to shine it on. So I think that this is a wake-up call for all of us. Also, in my experience, at least, people of color who would echo what you said about why is no one concerned when it's our kids, nevertheless share our outrage about all of these mass shootings. So this is, I know that you're not introducing a racialist element here. I just want to caution us that we hear the wisdom in what Jeanette said, but avoid a very dangerous kind of polarization that lurks not behind what she's saying, but behind this unfortunate reality.
Okay, well, thank you, Temple. Thank you, Jim, so much for this. This is a little not exactly what the New Thought community is accustomed to, but AG&T thinks it's important that we up-level our game a little bit when it comes to discussing these issues, even if they feel uncomfortable at times. So our next program is March 22nd. My co-host there will be Reverend Wendy Craig Purcell. We're going to be sending out by tomorrow, everyone on this call and everyone who's registered for the webinar but was not able to show up live tonight will have access to this recording. So by tomorrow, you'll receive an email telling you exactly how you can get that recording. Please share it with friends, and please encourage people to sign up for this webinar. It's free. It's going to be going on every month for the rest of the year, and I'm not sure what our topic is going to be for next month, because what's true about that is we have to wait and see what crazy thing happens between now and March 22nd so that we know what we need to talk about. So anyway, thank you so much for being here and for caring about this stuff, because we really appreciate the commitment. So see you next time. Thank you. Bye.